Good evening and welcome to the 22nd Annual Frederick Douglass Book Prize. My name is Marcia Darbuz. I am a sophomore at Columbia University, majoring in human rights and behavior with a concentration with human rights on the pre-med track. I have been a member of the Student Advisory Council at the Gilder Lehrman Institute since 2017. I am thrilled to be here this evening with you all speaking at this important event. The Frederick Douglass Book Prize is one of the most prestigious awards in its field. And while we are sad to not be able to gather in celebration with you in person, we are honored to take this program online and to be joined by over 1,000 teachers, students, and history lovers across the country. Before we get started, I'm going to briefly go over what's in store for you over the next hour. To kick things off, we're going to hear some opening remarks by Jim Basker, president of the Gilder Lehrman Institute, and David Blight, director of the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University. We will then hear from Professor Sophie White, winner of this year's award, and then she will take questions from the audience. To submit a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We are going to keep the chat closed to minimize any distractions during the program. With that, I'd like to turn things over to Jim Basker, president of the Gilder Lehrman Institute. Take it away, Jim.
Thank you, Marcia, for that welcome and for taking the time from your studies at Columbia University to be with us tonight. Marcia is one of the 50 or so brilliant, service-oriented, passionate students on our Student Advisory Council. You'll be meeting more of them very shortly. But now it is my privilege to welcome you to the 22nd Annual Frederick Douglass Book Prize ceremony, though, of course, the first ever to be held on Zoom. Thank you all for joining us. Tonight, a $25,000 prize will be presented to this year's winner, and you will hear from her later in the program. But because the past 12 months have been such a challenging, historic, and emotional time for all of us and for our country, I wanted to take a few minutes to tell you about the origins and history of the Frederick Douglass Prize, which is co-sponsored by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, based in New York City, and the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, based at Yale University. It began in the mid-1990s when our founders, Richard Gilder and Louis Lehrman, heard a public lecture on the transatlantic slave trade by the legendary David Bryan Davis. Dick and Lou decided that the colossal, tragic story of African slavery in the New World that David was telling was too little known by the general public and too little taught in our schools. Thus inspired, within months, Dick and Lou founded the Institute and sponsored their first teacher seminar, led by Professor Davis at Yale. 2 years later, when I became president of the Institute, I'm proud to report that the very first assignment they gave me was to go up to Yale and negotiate the details needed to establish the Gilder Lehrman Center, to be directed by David Bryan Davis. Since 1998, the best books in the field of slavery studies, selected by juries of leading scholars, have been recognized by the prize. Some 28 books were nominated that first year, but now the field has grown so that twice or three times that many books are considered every year. Back in 1998, the late Jim Horton, a great scholar and a wonderful man, was on that first jury. And since then, we have had such illustrious jurors as Seymour Drescher, Chris Brown, Brenda Stevenson, Graham Hodges, Elizabeth Alexander, Stephanie McCurry, Ned Blackhawk, Vincent Brown, Manisha Sinha, and Thavolia Glimpf, among many other distinguished scholars. The first year, we had co-winners, Ira Berlin for Many Thousands Gone, and Phil Morgan for Slave Counterpoint. Then David Eltis in the second year for The Rise of African Slavery in the Americas. And in year 3, David Blight for his widely acclaimed Race and Reunion. One can see the standard of scholarship that has defined the prize from the beginning. And from the beginning, we have also included K-12 teachers and students as guests at all our award events, as it is entirely they who ultimately matter most in our efforts to make this scholarship known to the widest possible audience and to future generations. More than 1,000 secondary school teachers and students registered for this event tonight. And those who brought a group of their students will be sent a copy of the winning book for the class library. We shall always be grateful to Dick and Lou for founding the prize and supporting it so generously, both financially and intellectually. In recent years, we have received funding support from an ever-increasing number of supporters eager to provide books for teachers and students, including some of the leading African-American philanthropists in New York City. Among them, our friends Ken and Kathy Chenault, Ray McGuire, Marva Smalls, Deborah Roberts, and Bill and Carol Sutton Lewis. We are particularly grateful to Lois Childs, not only for her generosity this year, but for her indefatigable support and kindness over the past 15 years, supporting and escorting her beloved husband, Dick Gilder, to the ceremony and applauding the honorees without fail every year. This is especially meaningful to all of us because last May, we lost Dick, who died peacefully after an extraordinarily full life, just 2 weeks shy of his 88th birthday. For that reason, we are dedicating this evening's event to the memory of Dick Gilder, in gratitude for all that he did and for our unbelievable good fortune in having the chance to work with him. Now for a quick look at some more of the highlight moments in the history of the prize, please enjoy this short video.
Named for Frederick Douglass, the formerly enslaved man who escaped bondage to emerge as one of the greatest American orators, writers, reformers, and abolitionists of the 19th century. The Frederick Douglass Book Prize has been awarded to the year's best book published in English on the subject of slavery, resistance, or abolition since the prize's creation in 1999. In 23 years, the Frederick Douglass Book Prize Committee has considered more than 1,600 books and awarded more than $500,000 in prizes to such renowned scholars, including Ira Berlin, Annette Gordon-Reed, Seymour Drescher, Erica Dunbar, Taya Miles, and many others. This preeminent book prize ensures that global histories of slavery, resistance, and abolition are situated in the mainstream of American history and education, and in illuminating the best and most groundbreaking historical works. The Frederick Douglass Book Prize stimulates scholarship in the field of global slavery studies. The life of Frederick Douglass showed the power of knowledge and truth in sparking change. For in his own words, it is not light that we need, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The Frederick Douglass Book Prize is sponsored jointly by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History and the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at the Macmillan Center at Yale University.
Now to this year's prize. I want to introduce 3 other members of our Student Advisory Council who will in turn present each of the finalists for this year's Frederick Douglass Prize before David Blight is introduced to present this year's winner. The 3 student presenters are leading members of our advisory council, which consists of top students nominated by their history teachers and elected to serve on the council as a body of advisors to the Institute, reviewing our programs, evaluating resources and curriculum, and suggesting new initiatives. During the early stages of the COVID crisis, when schools were so disrupted, these students met every week to help us plan adjustments on the fly. Some of our new online programs came about with their help. Our history school, free and open to any student anywhere, elementary, middle, or high school. Inside the Vault, our new online curatorial program that twice a month presents rare documents with experts to discuss them. And Book Breaks, our weekly program that features a recent book by a major historian every Sunday at 2 p.m. Since school restarted in the fall, the Student Advisory Council has cut back to meeting once a month. But at each meeting, we have students from all over the country, Florida to Alaska, California to Massachusetts, gathering to advise us. The 3 students who will speak next will give you an idea of the outstanding young people who serve on this council. Each of them will recognize one of the finalists for this year's Frederick Douglass Prize. They are, first, Anjali Gonzalez, a graduate of Fort Hamilton High School in Brooklyn, now a sophomore at Emerson College in Boston. Then Dhruv Rungta, a junior at John P. Stevens High School in New Jersey. And then Agatha Niarco, a junior at Stuyvesant High School in New York City. After they name each of the three finalists, Marcia Darbuz will return to introduce David Blight, who will in turn present this year's award. Enjoy the rest of the program, and please contact us if you would like to know more about how you could be involved in our efforts to improve the teaching and learning of American history and to fight historical illiteracy. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anjali Gonzalez, and I'm a sophomore at Emerson College, majoring in communication studies with a minor in journalism. I have been a member of the Gilder Lehrman National Student Advisory Council since 2017, and I'm honored to introduce one of three distinguished finalists for this year's award, Professor Kelly Carter Jackson, for her book Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. This book provides a detailed analysis on the tactical use of violence among antebellum Black activists. It explores the decisions, strategies, and actions of Black abolitionists who, through lacking an official political voice, were nevertheless responsible for instigating major social and political change. Carter Jackson is the Naval Assistant Professor of the Humanities in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. Congratulations, Professor Carter Jackson.
Good evening. My name is Dhruv Rungta, and I'm a junior at John P. Stevens High School in New Jersey, and a member of the National Student Advisory Council at the Gilder Lehrman Institute. It is my honor to introduce the second finalist for this year's prize, Professor Kayla Grinberg, for her book, A Black Jurist in a Slave Society, Antonio Pereira Rebosas and the Trials of Brazilian Citizenship, published by the University of North Carolina Press. One of the most prominent specialists in civil law of his time, Rebosas played a central and conflicted role as Brazilians struggled to define citizenship and understand racial politics. In tracing the life of this Afro-Brazilian intellectual, Grinberg demonstrates how Rebosas' life and career are essential to our understanding of Atlantic slave and post-abolition societies. Grinberg is an associate professor of history at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Congratulations, Professor Grinberg.
Hi, everyone. My name is Agatha Niarco, and I am a junior at Stuyvesant High School, a Gilder Lehrman affiliate school in New York City. I have been a member of the Student Advisory Council since 2019, and I'm honored to recognize the third finalist for the 22nd Annual Frederick Douglass Book Prize, Professor Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers, for her book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, published by Yale University Press. In looking at the role of white women in American slavery, she provides evidence that white women were actually sophisticated economic actors who directly engaged in the South's slave market. Because women typically inherited more slaves than land, she argues that white women actively participated in the slave market and used it for economic and social empowerment. Jones-Rogers is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley. Congratulations, Professor Jones-Rogers.
Thanks, Agatha, and congratulations to all the finalists. We had almost 70 outstanding books submitted for this year's prize and are thrilled to recognize these finalists, in particular for their outstanding scholarship and contributions to the field. Next up, I am pleased to welcome to the program David Blight. David is the Sterling Professor of History, of African American Studies, and of American Studies at Yale University. He is also the director of the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale, the world's first institution entirely devoted to scholarship and public education about the role of slavery and its legacies. He has won countless awards for his scholarship, including a Pulitzer Prize for History for his seminal work, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. David is a longtime friend of the Gilder Lehrman Institute, and we are so thrilled to have him here with us tonight to introduce this year's prize winner. Without further ado, here is Professor David Blight.
Well, thank you, Marcia. And if we were all in person right now, I would get everybody up to give a big round of applause for all of the students. A special thanks to you, Marcia, to Anjali, to Dhruv, and to Agatha for your role in introducing us all and running this show. You guys are the highlight, really. Well, welcome everybody. I'm thrilled that so many of you did tune in tonight. We will be back in person by next year. But I want to just say quickly at the outset, the whole purpose of this book prize ceremony and event, at least in all the years I've been involved, which is something like 16 or 17 now, is to have a celebration of books, a celebration of reading history. And you all are tuned in tonight because you're part of that community. You're part of that guild that just loves books. And indeed, in recent times, we've, among Americans, have been yearning for a foothold, yearning for guidance of how did we get here? Well, the Douglass Book Prize, again, goes back to Richard Gilder and Lou Lehrman. I want to add my voice to Jim's and paying tribute tonight to the memory of Dick Gilder. And a special thanks to Lois Childs, who I hope is joining us tonight. I also want to add to that that we lost David Bryan Davis last year as well, all in the course of 1 year. We lost Dick Gilder, who was the primary source of the resources that made both the GLI in New York and the GLC at Yale possible. But it was David Davis that created our center here at Yale. The center was in effect created around David's masterly work. He was, by almost any estimation, the greatest modern scholar of slavery in the world and in the Americas. So let's have this in his honor tonight too. I want to thank my staff at the GLC at Yale, Michelle Zaks, Melissa McGrath, Tom Thurston, Daniel Vera, and Lisa Monroe. They make everything we do at Yale possible. We are involved in all kinds of projects, as many of you know, everything from giving fellowships to scholars. In fact, tonight's winner of the book prize was once a fellow at our center. All sorts of outreach to teachers. We're helping the state of Connecticut run its new program in mandating both Latino and African-American history in the public schools. And at Yale, I've been asked to chair, and the GLC has been asked to manage Yale's now, it'll be a year or year and a half study of the university's relationships to slavery. That's another long story. We'll spare you, but there will be a lot of coming events about that. And just a word about Douglass. I talk about Douglass all the time, but there's always something new to learn about him. If any of you are watching the Netflix series called Amend, which is the 6-part, quite extraordinary and unusual documentary about the 14th Amendment, there are many talking heads and voices throughout it, including yours truly, but one of my favorites is Sherilyn Ifill, who is the lead attorney of the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP. And they made Douglass a big part of episode 1. And at one point, she just sits and stares into the camera and says, "Frederick Douglass, his name to me has always been like a prayer." I'd never heard that before. And I'm gonna use that line. I'm gonna have to get permission from Sherilyn Ifill, I'm sure. Now, let me pay a quick tribute to the jury. You've already heard about the other finalists. It was an extraordinary batch of finalists this year. We usually only have 3 finalists. This time we had 4 because the jury said there's just too many good books. One of them, indeed, by Kayla Grinberg, is a translation. It's the first time, I believe, we've ever had a translation as one of the finalists. The way this works is I appoint every year a jury of distinguished historians, and believe me, there is no lack of these in this field. And almost no one has ever turned us down. The only reason people turn us down is because they have a leave year, they have other work they have to get done. But this year was an extraordinary jury of very distinguished scholars. I can't go into all of their backgrounds and work, but they were Jane Landers of Vanderbilt University, who is one of the best scholars we know about slavery and fugitive slaves in Florida, in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic world. And then Martha Jones of Johns Hopkins University, a major scholar of Black citizenship, of African-American women in the 19th century and many other things. And then finally, Roquinaldo Fierro. Rocky teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a very distinguished historian of the Atlantic world, of Angola and Brazil. And so we had the world represented here in many ways, and that's always the goal, a jury that can somehow represent at least a triangle of the many, many fields involved in slavery and abolition studies over time. They choose the finalists, and then we have a board, which consists of Jim Basker, me, Michelle Zaks, my associate director at Yale, one other Yale faculty member, and then the jury meet, and we have a seminar, usually for 2 hours, to determine who wins the prize. Now, my last act then is to turn this over to Sophie White and to tell you just a little bit about why this book was chosen as this year's Frederick Douglass Book Prize winner. First of all, Sophie is a professor of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She is a native of Mauritius, a former French colony in the Indian Ocean. She's also involved in Africana studies and European studies at Notre Dame. She wears many hats there. She's really a kind of an early Americanist, a scholar particularly of the French colonial empire, former GLC fellow, as I mentioned. Her other books include the first book, Wild Frenchmen and Frenchified Indians, Material Culture and Race in Colonial Louisiana, which was published in 2012. She's co-editor with Trevor Bernard of Hearing Enslaved Voices, African and Indian Slave Testimony in British and French America. The book that wins this year, though, and it's a stunning book for the research and the writing, but particularly the research in this case, is Voices of the Enslaved, Love, Labor, and Longing in French Louisiana, published by the University of North Carolina Press. So congratulations once again to UNC Press. By the way, there's a real test going on, a real contest going on now over the years of which presses have had the most winners. And it's now a race between UNC, Harvard Press, and Yale Press. So we'll see how that turns out. Ask me again in another 10 years, you might have a winner there. This book has already won about 4 or 5 other prizes. I won't go into all of those, but here's why this is such an extraordinary work. Many of you out there have heard many times, especially if you ever attend a history conference, historians are fussing over this archive and that archive, and this subject just doesn't have a big archive, and that one has a bigger archive, and how do you use the archive, and where did you find this, and so on. This book is a particular example of a story that one might have assumed you could never get to. You could never really understand. The enslaved people of 18th century Louisiana, living in the French Empire, and many of them have taken French names, and they will be bilingual at least in French, if not more languages. But what were their lives like? What sort of punishments and treatments did they endure? What was their labor like? Well, the best place to find that, it turns out, especially in French imperial system, were the courts, court records, because the French, as I understand this book, had a peculiar obsession with recording court testimonies. And from a sample of roughly about 150 of these court testimonies of enslaved people for a put on trial or testifying against others who are put on trial, comes autobiographical narratives that Sophie Smith, with her skills with language, and she did all of her own translations in this book, where a skillful historian can go into these narratives and recreate people's lives. We learn here in these depositions, especially from the 4 major cases that Sophie concentrated on, we learn a lot about this world of 18th century enslavement in the imperial system in the Americas. We learn a lot about the brutality and indeed tortures, some of them medieval tortures that were used. But we also learn a lot about life and labor and the church and courtrooms and prisons and plantations and life in the bayous and life in the convents. And we also learn a lot about people's values. Many of these people had been born in Africa. Some of them were born here in the Americas. But these are African peoples transforming into something culturally new, but undergoing tremendous pressure and tremendous oppression under this slave system. But they get to say their piece in one way or another in so many of these courtrooms. I found it just an amazing example, as did our jury, I can assure you, of the deft, skillful use of sources by a historian who can then convert it into great storytelling. It really is what our craft is about. And this book is really a book that deserves the prize for several reasons, but it's because it's a work of the craft of history. Let me just put it that way. And I will just add one last thing here to what Jim Basker so beautifully said in that little film you saw about the history of this prize. This is a storied book prize now, and we're very proud of it. The 22nd year of this prize. Its winners have been, and even the finalists have been, a who's who of historians of the Atlantic world, of race and slavery in the Americas, of the abolition movements in Europe, in the Atlantic world, and in America, of the legacies of slavery and of the slave trade. And it truly is a who's who. From Ira Berlin, now the great late Ira Berlin, through Annette Gordon Reed, to Rebecca Scott, to Taya Miles, to Laurent Dubois, and again, I could go on and on and on. And among the book talks that we do, and then we're doing them all online now, of course, we always do a book talk with whoever wins the prize. And just last week, I conducted a book talk event with last year's winner, Amy Morell Taylor, for her book called Embattled Freedom, which is all about the refugee camps during the Civil War. So we will be having Sophie for one of these book talk events, probably next fall, for a much longer discussion of this book. But right now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Sophie White of the University of Notre Dame, this year's winner of the Douglass Prize. She is located tonight, I must say, in London, England. So it's rather late tonight in London, but I'm told she set 3 alarm clocks to make sure she was up and ready for this event tonight. So Sophie, congratulations on the Douglass Prize, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, David, for that generous introduction, and also what terrific students to present. Thank you also to the Gilder Lehrman Institute, the Gilder Lehrman Center, for this tremendous offer, which of course I share with the 3 other finalists. And thank you for that dream jury. I spent so many years working on this book, and I'm grateful for funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the GLC and my own institution, the University of Notre Dame. And so to win the Douglass Prize and the other 6 book prizes that the book has won is also an acknowledgement of the importance of funding research on slavery and race, especially in light of pressing questions linked to the Black Lives Matter movement and the deep history of race in North America. I have a few other acknowledgements. First, to my visionary editor at the Omohundro Institute, Professor Kathy Kelly. And also I wanted to acknowledge Professors Jennifer Morgan and Emily Clark, whose belief in this project made all the difference at a really crucial juncture, really letting me know it was ready and I could let go of it. Of course, there have also been so many other scholars who've influenced me along the way, who've nurtured me intellectually, and often at the same time with bonds of friendship. I'm also more grateful than I tell them to my family, my friends, my talisman, and my beloved ones who hold me in their hearts. You know who you are. and that includes my precious daughters, Cleome and Josephine. Now, many of my predecessors in winning this prize have quoted Frederick Douglass. Well, I'm instead going to cite a previous winner of the Douglass Prize, Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, because I think she really puts very succinctly the problem that we have in studying slavery. Writing about 12 Years a Slave, she posed this question that's so frustrating for those of us who work on slavery. Quote, which historical voices should be deemed legitimate? These questions are particularly fraught when one is dealing with past atrocities, like America's racially based system of chattel slavery. Then there is history's cruel irony. The individuals who bore the brunt of the system, the enslaved, lived under a shroud of enforced anonymity. The vast majority could neither read nor write, and they therefore left behind no documents, which are the lifeblood of the historian's craft, unquote. Some enslaved have left behind documents, including slave narratives like 12 Years a Slave or the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, but they are the exception. How do we get at the lives of those other millions who lived under that shroud of anonymity and of invisibility and who also matter? And can we? Well, first we need to remember that those slave narratives are a very particular literary genre. It's a type of writing that linked abolition to Anglo-American Protestant traditions. And so it's a literary genre that is unique to the Anglophone world. For example, for the period and place I study, Louisiana in the 18th century, there are no slave narratives of this kind. And so to make that genre the gold standard for slave autobiography can sometimes blind us to other potential archives in which individuals narrated their lives. And Voices of the Enslaved delves into one such archive. Because while France and the French Empire generated no slave narratives that type, it did generate, as David mentioned in discussing my book, it did generate precious archival material, the testimony of enslaved individuals. And it's not at first sight really promising. We are dealing with fragments, we're dealing with moments in time, and it's a very problematic kind of source. And yet they did leave behind documents. They testified as defendants and accomplices, but also as witnesses and just random bystanders, sometimes as victims. And as they spoke and narrated, their words were systematically and very precisely recorded by court scribes, down to the inclusion of dialogue, of turns of speech, of metaphors, and sometimes even passages in Creole. And I am from Mauritius, and I grew up speaking French, English, and Creole. And it is extraordinary to have that evidence from the 18th century. So this is a book about individuals, and it's a book about archives, their silences, and their eloquence. An archive that offers an alternative set of historical voices and life stories, because the random and not so random circumstances that led to an enslaved person's appearance in court introduced a broader pool of individuals with a wider range of perspectives and life experiences. And their lives bear writing about, and their lives must be thought about, not least because it's their own words that help us do so. So though my book includes trials from the French Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, especially Mauritius, it is primarily based on the records from Louisiana, where we have these surviving records, the voices of these 150 enslaved individuals. And many scholars have worked on this material. I myself had worked on them for some years, and then one day I had my aha moment. And that was in a criminal trial that I was reading, and this young man is testifying, and the scribe at some point is, writing down the answer that the young man is saying. And he says, and then Etienne said without being asked, and it goes on for another page of testimony. Then the scribe says, and then Etienne said again without being asked, and he wrote it all down. And the third time, and then Etienne said on his own initiative, and he carried on. So it told me two things. One, that the scribe wrote everything down. Two, that deponents were constantly redirecting the court's focus away from the questions that they were being asked, which are not always relevant to them, but instead to offer details about their own experiences. And it taught me that we too need to pivot our focus away from that court case. And the payoff is huge, because when they veered off subject, these deponents offer details that seem irrelevant at first, but in fact, they're deeply revealing and they're quite often riveting. Further, that testimony was anchored in the deponents' own experiences and their ways of knowing. It was autobiographical because it expressed how individuals looked at their world and how they evaluated it and how they made sense of it. I then had a second aha moment because I went back to the archives and looked at all the trials again. And the second aha moment was that when they deviated from the questioning to talk about other topics without being asked, so much of what these individuals brought up relates to their humanity. The endless, unceasing, inexorable pain of being enslaved and all that that meant in every aspect of their lives, because it touched every aspect of their lives, their suffering, and actually, more often than not, they talked about the suffering of loved ones, but also their attachments and their rivalries, their sense of humor, their emotions, their love, and their longing for loved ones. And through it all, we have narratives that are brimming with personality, character, humor, emotions, and humanity, in which these individuals seem to quite literally spring to life. And I want to give you just one little snapshot, the Testimony of Louisa. She's a middle-aged woman. She's attacked while doing the laundry by a drunken white soldier called Pushne, and he's attacked her with his blade, with a blade from his gun. And in her testimony, she says she fell. Pushne gave her more blows to her body and her arm, which pierced her. She wanted again to flee, but Pushne said to her, "Go on, kneel and ask my forgiveness." She replied, "It's only from God that we ask forgiveness." That in spite of this, she got on her knees and said to him, "Sorry, sir." And he attacked her again. Now, what strikes me in this passage is her claim to moral superiority. She's telling off a young man for telling him off and putting herself forward as the morally superior person here. Yet she got on her knees and called him sir. Of course, he's about to attack her, but it's also because being enslaved required her to do that even when being abused. George Floyd also called his assailant sir, as the man put his knees on Floyd's neck. So this is a book about individuals and how in their own words they tell us about themselves and their experiences and how they handled being enslaved. This is rare and often moving information, especially because so few individuals led the kinds of lives that left enough material to anchor full-scale biographies. I, as a historian, have chosen to ride less traveled paths, looking for pebbles of evidence, even when there seem none to find. And on that path, I've found in the archives whole full-fledged individuals hollering out to me sometimes, calling for attention. And I have heard that some of their descendants of those I write about in the book, are in the audience tonight, and that gives me chills. And it was harder than you know to pick the ones whose stories I would feature in the book. And so in my brief remarks, I can only urge you to read about them and hear their voices. And for now, I say their names: Marguerite, Louison, Lisette, Marie-Jeanne, Francisco, Hector, Démocrite, Jean-Baptiste, Quenet, François Xavier. I say their names, or rather, if I have done my job correctly, I have let them say their names and tell their own truths. I had mentioned how hard it was to select the individuals who center each chapter. I would like to invite you to stay in touch and follow my progress, because I'm working on a digital humanities project on this slave testimony, which will launch this fall with the Omohundra Institute. Because the good news is there are 150 individuals in these archives, and I'll be featuring some of them on that website. I would like to conclude tonight by reading from the epilogue to the book. It's an invitation masquerading as a conclusion. Their courtroom narratives lift these individuals from anonymity, even as their stories underscore the heart-wrenching banality of the violence of slavery. Yet here were real people who lived full lives. We are the richer for having encountered them, however fleetingly. And whenever they did have the opportunity to speak and have their words recorded, we surely owe it to them to listen and to try to hear. Thank you very much for this great honor, and I'd be so happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your incredible words, Professor White. We are now going to move into the Q&A portion of the program. I'd like to remind audience members that if you have a question, you can enter it using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We're going to kick things off with a couple of questions from students in the audience. And the first question is from Kushi Suri, a student at High Point Regional High School. And their question is, what inspired you to learn about these topics and write a book about it?
Wow, I think the easy answer is the minute I came across this archive. I have been working on it for so long and was drawn to these stories that are within the Louisiana records. But it took me a while to dedicate myself completely to it. And I think that aha moment, or those two aha moments I discussed, especially that first one, made me rethink what I wanted to do with this book. And I'm just so grateful for that. So it just changed the course of where I was going and who I was going to write about and how I was going to write it and how I was going to try to allow those voices to be foregrounded.
Thank you for sharing that experience, Professor. Our next question is from Jonathan Schneiderman, a student at Stuyvesant High School. In your assessment, what stands out as the most notable difference between the Black experience in Louisiana versus the United States? And what stands out as the biggest commonality?
You know, I'm going to start with the differences are how different empires structured slavery or the experience of slavery. Louisiana was a Catholic colony, so religion is part of how that is perceived and structured. And which means, for example, that one of the differences is that legal slave marriage is allowed in Louisiana, and there are going to be some legal protections for slave families. It doesn't mean that those protections are necessarily followed. The law says one thing, it doesn't necessarily mean that the law is being followed. But those are some of the probably biggest differences. Also, Louisiana is extraordinary and unusual in that most of the enslaved who arrived crossing the Middle Passage have arrived by 1731. So it's a very particular population. But in terms of the commonalities, I mean, I get asked this a lot, how pertinent is the material I have uncovered in terms of understanding slavery elsewhere? And I think those themes of humanity, of love, labor, and longing are pretty consistent, as is, of course, the history of violence and abuse, and the systemic abuse of Black bodies is sadly one of the greatest commonalities, but as is also this endless quest by the enslaved to reassert their humanity. And in the testimony, they do that over and over and over again, to the point sometimes of seeming to offer intellectual critiques of slavery.
Thank you so much for that. Our next question is from Diana Spencer, asking, how did your experience growing up in Mauritius shape your interest in the study of slavery and abolition?
Yeah, immeasurably. I grew up in a charmed island. It's a tropical paradise. It's a turquoise waters, sea. It's a lovely, it's a beautiful place. It's a special place. But growing up there, I was always aware that the charms, especially that I enjoyed, was was just hiding underneath the surface and really not very far beneath the surface, the legacies of slavery and also Indian indenture on that island. And so it's an extraordinary place, but it still carries those scars. Mm.
Thank you, Professor White. Our next question is from Kathy Casey. Did Douglass address the issue of prejudice against other minority groups in the United States?
I feel I should send that one on to David Blight. Professor Blight will answer that one in far more detail than I. So I'm going to pass on that one. I don't dare say anything about Frederick Douglass on the same limelight as the foremost historian of Frederick Douglass.
No worries. We'll
Yeah,
move
it was
on
good,
to the
wasn't
next
it? I was good at that one.
Yeah. Okay, our next question is from Zoe Anderson, and it is, while you were working on your book, was there something you learned that stood out to you or led you to a strong emotional reaction?
Yeah, a lot of moments. And what happens is, so I have these 4 chapters, and there are many individuals mentioned, but 4 of them are centered on a particular court case. And I would spend a lot of time with each of those, and I'd revisit them. I'd spend a lot of time. And while I was immersed thinking about them, I'm very attached to these individuals, strangely enough. But I think the most striking one is in writing a chapter on Francisco, who's this runaway who shows up, and he tries to immerse himself in a local slave community on a plantation. And originally they welcome him, and he comes to the dances, and he pays for the drums, and he flirts for the women. And after a while, the men from that plantation start getting, quite jealous and protective also of their women. It turns out the women are quite enjoying flirting with this new arrival, but the men are protective, possibly with good reason. And so it was going to be the story of this Francisco. But his main antagonist, Democrite, also is the one who's giving us so much information. And so the chapter became Francisco and Democrite. And then there was also Hector. And Hector wasn't at all going to be in the chapter because he doesn't testify in court. But in fact, his words are given pretty much verbatim by Democrite. And so we actually have passages in which we hear Hector's voice. And he had always been, almost tapping on my shoulder, do something with me. Don't just, write me out of this chapter. And I was talking, in fact, with Professor Emily Clark, whom I mentioned at the start of my remarks. And she said, wait, let's just try a few more things and see if I can find him. I think I might have a lead on him. And she found a lead on him. And that one lead led to many other leads, because it's not just about the trial. So much of this is, I'm also reconstructing lives by looking at other archives and other documents. And in the end, Hector, we found a reference to Hector when he was a child, and the names of his mother and his father and his 3 siblings. And then we found other documents about him that documented that he was still alive at age 91, about 40 years after the trial that he appears in. And that's when I get very emotional. And I'll just give one other example, which is that there's another story, a love story. It's a love story of a man and a woman who belong to different owners. And they have tried for 14 years to be together. He's tried to get his owner to buy her. She's tried to get hers to buy him, and it doesn't work. And they run away. But at least 14 years they're in love. And at some point they take a very treacherous journey over the water to try and escape. And seeing that pass and seeing just how treacherous it is, and realizing that they went on a tiny boat, it's hard not to get emotional, to think about how much, in their case, they're longing for each other. catapulted their urge to run away and to escape, even though it could have been fatal.
Thank you for sharing. I think it's so interesting how you form emotional connections with historical figures. The next question is from Brian Lard, and it's, what did you come across in your research that might connect to how we think about the Black experience in the modern era?
It's really hard not to see connections. I mean, as a historian, we try not to be linear, and because things have changed since the colonial period, right? But I think, but the US, for example, is built on laws, many laws that emerge, were put in place in the colonial period, and there are echoes of those. And I think probably the biggest is that there was a legal system that decreed that one group of people would always have the decks stacked against them, always. Even in Louisiana, even a free person of color who's no longer enslaved, there are so many legal mechanisms in which they can be re-enslaved for the slightest thing. And so that inscribing of race and stacking the deck against one set of people, we're still living with that legacy. And I, you know, it's just so hard not to see it happening over and over and over again.
Thank you so much for that answer. The next question is from John, asking, how do you work around mitigating your own experience of white privilege while writing a book about people of color, slavery, and abolition?
I suppose I have no choice in a way, because of who I am and where I come from and how I grew up. But I think it's important enough work. I happen to have some skills, and to be honest, they're kind of mostly the linguistic skills. And so, you know, academics, we often have quite big egos, but in this instance, I'd be so happy for someone else to go and look at the same archives, and if they have come up with completely different conclusions, that's great. But what I tried with this book is to really let that testimony speak for itself. Obviously, I'm having to interpret some of it, but really, I give big chunks of testimony. And I've kept both the French, for those who want to look at the original, and the English. And with this digital humanities project, I'm trying to take that a step further, because there'll be the original document in its manuscript form, there'll be the French transcription, and then there'll be an English translation. And I will have a kind of very bare bones commentary. And my hope is that others will go and look at those, and they can do that work of interpreting. They don't need me anymore. And I suppose that's one of the ways I try to mitigate it, to just uncover and present and allow others to see what they see in there. I don't think there's much more I can do. Well, there probably is, but that's how that's the solution I've come to.
Then, as a follow-up question to the linguistic skills, were you always interested in history, or did it kind of come later in life?
No, was not. I was not interested in history. I loved languages. I love literature, and actually those interests have served me really well, because I'm having to do, my undergraduate degree was in French literature, and here's a big secret: I have another master's degree and a PhD, and they are in art history, not history. So it's taken me a while to become a historian, or to be recognized as one. And so another reason why this award is so so important for me. No, it took me a while, but it's been a few many years now that I have been absolutely persuaded by the importance of doing history. I love archives. I love archives, and I love looking at them in fresh ways. I think that's what I like to do. I did my first book, and with this one, trying to look at it from different angles and pulling it apart. But now I'm absolutely convinced history is my field. Thank you for allowing me in, historians.
Yes, thank you so much for that. Okay, we have time for just one more question this evening. And so the final question we will be asking you today is, what do you say to people who feel as if the issue of slavery and racism is no longer relevant today?
Where have they been and what are they looking at? This is such a problem. It's been such a difficult year, not just in terms of Black Lives Movement, but also COVID. And I often think, we talk about resilience and how we've survived this year, and we have nothing on enslaved individuals and what they had to go through. But the US just passed this milestone, 500,000 dead from COVID. And one of the things I do with my students often is when we talk about slavery, it's very easy to just come up with statistics and to present those. And part of my challenge and my job and part of their mission is to realize that each one of those is not a statistic. It's a person like them with loves and dislikes and annoyances and feelings. And so I think for those who would deny that, my only recourse is to remind them that these are people, that these are individuals. And we need to both understand the past and realize that the hurts haven't gone away, but to also see that those who are hurt, again, are people. They're people like you and I.
Very well said. Thank you so much, Professor White, for your responses. To everyone in the audience, we appreciate your questions, and I'm sorry that we did not get to answer more of them. But now I'm going to turn things over to Agatha, who will be closing out tonight's program.
That Q&A was phenomenal. Thank you again, Professor White, for taking questions from the audience. For anyone whose questions we didn't get to, I encourage you to continue the conversation on Sunday, March 21st at 2 p.m., where Professor White will be featured on Book Breaks, a free Gilder Lehrman online program. A link to register will be dropped in the chat below, and we hope you can join us then. We are also sharing links in the chat to our bookshop.org page, where you can purchase Voices of the Enslaved, as well as copies of all the finalist books. The Gilder Lehrman Institute has a whole range of public programs and resources for teachers, students, and history lovers. We hope that you will check out our website for more information on upcoming programs and to get further engaged with the Institute. In particular, we'd like to invite everyone here tonight to join us on April 19th for our next Book Prize event, where we will be celebrating both the 2020 and 2021 Lincoln Prize winners. You can register for that event through the link in the chat. Lastly, we'd like to thank our donors who supported this year's Frederick Douglass Book Prize and whose support allows us to provide this program for free. This prize helps us to ensure that African American history is situated in the mainstream of American history education, and we are deeply grateful for your support. If you enjoyed tonight's program and want to support the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, you can do so through the link in the chat. With that, thank you for joining us this evening, and congratulations again to Professor Sophie White. I hope that everyone has a great rest of your evening, and I hope to see you all at another Gilder Lehrman event soon. Bye, everybody.